Well, right about this time last week, most of the UK were tuning into their TVs with great anticipation to hear our Prime Minister Boris Johnson's latest speech. And the reason so many people were excited for Boris's speech was they couldn't wait to hear the latest developments on how we were going to get out of lockdown and take one step closer to normality. But after the speech, I'm sure you're aware, Boris came in for a lot of criticism, as many people said that he was really giving us a mixed message. The content was conflicting, and even at points it seemed contradictory. In fact, one guy, jokingly on Twitter, said this in his attempts to summarise Boris's message. Here's what he said. For all those of you who are confused, here was what Boris said. Go out, but stay in. Go to work, but don't. Sunbathe, oh, but don't. But all of this is conditional. Or not. Stay safe, stay home, but don't stay home. Go out, but don't. Stay alert on public transport, but only in phase 3. Whether or not you think Boris's message was contradictory or not, I'll leave that up to you. But one thing we can agree on is that in a general sense, when you receive mixed messages, when you receive a conflicting piece of information, one which contradicts itself, it can feel very confusing and very frustrating. You don't really know where you stand. And that's kind of the feeling that we get as we read through this psalm this evening, Psalm 95. As you read it for the first time, it almost seems like a mixed message. The second half of the psalm seems to completely contradict the first half of the psalm. It totally changes in tone and content. And for that reason, many scholars in the early 1900s actually believed that when the Bible was being put together, they kind of made a bit of a mistake by putting the first half and second half of this psalm together, because these scholars actually believed that they shouldn't go together. They're part of separate psalms because of the distinct difference in tone and content. As time's elapsed today, that's really a minority view, and probably for good reason. Firstly, there are other psalms where the second half differs greatly in tone and content from the first half. For example, Psalm 81 is another example. However, secondly, and more significantly, the psalmist here actually puts these two sections, conflicting sections, side by side in order to drive home his point. He intentionally uses a literary technique by placing two contrasting ideas beside each other. If you're an English buff, you'll know that's called juxtaposition, in order to really emphasize his message and communicate it in a more poignant way. And so as we work through this psalm and we see how contrasting these two halves of it are, it really makes our title divisions very, very easy. The first half, verses 1 to 7, you're going to see a warm invitation. And in the second half of 7b, really through to the end of the chapter, you see a stern warning. So a warm invitation and then a stern warning. Look with me firstly from verses 1 through to the start of verse 7, a warm invitation. The psalmist says this, "O come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. In his hand are the depths of the earth. The heights of the mountains are his also. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand." Well, it's pretty clear in those first 3 verses, isn't it, that you are being invited to something. And what are you being invited to? You're being invited to worship our God. That's really highlighted 3 times as the word come is used. You're invited to come to something, to come to worship. We're asked to come to worship in verse 1 and verse 2 and also then in verse 6. But although in the English we really only have one word for the word come, in the Hebrew there are different words, and actually in each invitation here, in verse 1 and verse 2 and verse 6, it's a different Hebrew word that is used, which gives a different nuance to each invitation that the psalmist gives us. You see, in verse 1, when the psalmist says, "Come and worship," in the Hebrew it's in the imperative. In other words, it's a command. It's kind of like whenever you were younger and you maybe disobeyed your mum and she said, "Come here now." That was a very different invitation to come than when, say, your friend knocked on your door and said, "Are you going to come out to play?" 2 very different invitations, right? One is more forceful than the other. And in verse 1, this is the forceful command to come. And so the psalmist says with that tone, "Come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation." But once again, his invitation then in verse 2 to come and worship isn't in the imperative. It's not a forceful command. Rather, this one is one which conjures up the idea of an encounter or a meeting. This is more of a warm embrace. When the psalmist says in verse 2, "Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. And then yet again, the third invitation to come in verse 6 carries an altogether different meaning. It's not a strong, forceful, imperative command. It's not one with a warm embrace or meeting. This third invitation to come in verse 6 is one which carries invitational characteristics. It's like when a friend invites you to come round for dinner. And so with that mood, the psalmist says in verse 6, "O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker." So 3 invitations to come, each with a different nuance, and when taken comprehensively with the different dynamic that each invitation gives us, it gives you a comprehensive picture of the total, warm, great, strong invitation that the psalmist is giving you to come and worship our God. But you know as well as I do, don't you, that whilst as Christians we should worship, and our lives should be marked by worship, we don't always feel like worshipping our great God. And by worship, I don't just mean singing, I mean offering our lives, our total lives, our full, utter beings in submission to God's word and fellowship with his people and praise to his name. Quite often we don't feel like worshipping. Maybe right now you don't feel like worshipping. Maybe more often than you would care to admit, you don't really feel like worshipping. And so this psalmist is well aware that you don't always feel like worshipping. And so he actually litters the first half of this psalm with 2 really powerful motivations for you to come and worship even when you don't really feel like it. 2 objective truths about God which should transcend the subjective feelings which you may have, which are fleeting, which come and go. 2 objective truths which you need to preach to yourself about God's very nature, which will then in turn compel you to come and to worship him even when your being is telling you that you don't feel like it. And so what's the first motivation? What's the first objective truth the psalmist gives us as a means of motivating us to come and worship? It's this. It's the truth about God's greatness. The truth about God's greatness. Look with me from verses 1 to 3 again, but specifically verse 3. It says this: "O come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For," there's the reason as to why we should do this, "for the Lord is a great God and a king above all gods." Don't miss that linking word "for" in verse 3, because it shows you that verse 3 is actually giving you the motivation to carry out the business of verse 1 and 2. In verse 1 and 2, we're told to come and worship and to bow down and to acknowledge God's greatness and sing to him and praise him. How are we going to do that? Verse 3, "For the Lord is great." That's why you should do it. The Lord is great. And so really in verse 3 to verse 5, the psalmist expounds for us a little bit about what it means that the Lord is great. Notice some of the things and the implications of God's greatness. Verse 3, it means that he is the king above all other gods. In other words, there are no gods as great as our God. There are many gods which are worshipped in our world, but our God is so great he rules above and beyond them all. But not just that. Secondly, notice at the start of verse 4, "In his hands are the depths of the earth." Think about that for a moment. God is so great that in his hands are the depths of the earth. Think about the things which fit comfortably into your hand. The things which fit comfortably into your hand are the things which you are in complete control of, and the things which you can use to fulfill your own purposes and desires. Something like a pen fits comfortably into your hand, and so you can do with that pen as you so desire. You can move it about, you can throw it, you can write with it, whatever you want. Because it fits comfortably into your hand, you can do with it what you want. A fork fits comfortably in your hand, and so you can do with it what you want. You can use it to move food around your plate or to put food into your mouth or whatever the case may be, put it in the dishwasher. Because a fork fits comfortably in your hand. But notice what fits comfortably into God's hand. Look at it again, verse 4a. The depths of the earth. In other words, God is in complete control of this entire universe. It fits comfortably in his hand. And so he uses this universe and this world to accomplish his purposes as he so pleases or desires. God literally controls and directs and maneuvers this entire universe with the same ease with which you use a fork to move food about your dinner plate, or that you use a pen to write things on a piece of paper. That's how great our God is. He's the king above all gods. He has the world comfortably in his hand. Notice thirdly, at the end of verse 4 and the start of verse 5, he's in control over nature. It says, the heights of the mountains are his also. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. We've been reminded in this season as to just how powerful nature really is, that a virus could kill thousands and thousands of people. We know that volcanoes and tornadoes and hurricanes can cause devastation. Yet our God's even in control of nature. All this reminds us really of that famous saying by Abraham Kuyper, who said this: there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. Our God really is great, and our God really is in control. And you know, quite often in our lives, when we think about God's greatness and his control over all things, that's a real comfort to us. And we actually use that as a means of praising and thanking God. And so we can declare with ease, God is great, God is in control. But quite often, if we're honest, the reason we can declare that with such joy and happiness and ease is because we still actually subconsciously think that we're in control, don't we? And so perhaps right now, in this season of life that you find yourself in, with the uniqueness that it brings, there are many areas of your life with which, if you're honest, you actually have zero control. I wonder what area of your life right now do you feel like you've got zero control? Your health, your future, your business, loved ones that you care for? And now, as you're in this season whereby you have zero control, with how much ease and with how much joy are you able to declare, God is in control? Do you struggle to believe it? This is when our doctrine is tested. We can proclaim it with our lips. But now, when our control has been completely removed, can we really proclaim it with our hearts and find joy in it in our hearts? If not, we would do well to meditate on the psalmist's words in verse 3 to verse 5 and meditate on the greatness and the control of our Lord. But in light of his greatness and in light of his control, what does this psalmist command us to do? Well, look at verse 6 again. It says, "O come, let us worship. O come and let us worship." In light of God's control, in light of God's greatness, what are we to do? We're to come and worship. Now, when we think about the word worship, we quite often think about it as ascribing worth to something, don't we? And that's quite often what worship means, to ascribe worth to something. And so when we worship God, we ascribe worth to God. But actually in this instance, in this verse, that's not what the word worship means. The root of this word worship in verse 6 literally means to get low. It's a posture. To get low, it's kind of to humble yourself. It's like the posture you would take if you were to meet the Queen. In light of her greatness, when you meet the Queen, what do? You get low. You change your posture. In other words, in light of your greatness, your majesty, I'm getting low. And so this is what the psalmist is commanding you to do in light of God's greatness, in light of the fact that he really is in control of all things, as we've saw in verse 3 to 5. You need to change your posture. You need to worship. You need to get low. But notice that the psalmist goes further. He doesn't just say get low or worship. He actually uses two more verbs or two more postures that you ought to adopt in light of God's greatness and God's control. Look at verse 6 again. It says, "Come, let us worship," but don't just worship, also bow down. And then don't just bow down, let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. Do you see that? Three different postures, and he uses an interesting literary technique almost to say that these three different postures, as the psalmist goes through them, they increase in intensity. It's almost as if the psalmist is saying this: God is great and he's in control, and so in light of that, get low. Humble yourself. But don't just humble yourself, don't just get low, go even further. Bow down. But actually even that's not enough. You need to go even further. You actually need to kneel before the Lord. Get the whole way down. Humble yourself completely, totally in light of the greatness and the complete control of our God. Isn't that astonishing? Humble yourself before the great God. That's the only proper response in light of God's greatness. Totally humble yourself. Acknowledge you're not in control, but God is. And you know, quite ironically, this posture of humbling yourself before the Lord is actually the key to living a life free from anxiety, isn't it? That we humble ourselves before the Lord, that we acknowledge that we're not in control, He is. That's the key to a less anxious life. Do you know, in our anxieties, we quite often quote the passage in 1 Peter chapter 5 verses 7 where it says, cast all your cares or cast all your anxieties upon him because he cares for you. But we actually forget verse 6, the verse that comes right before it, where the actual command is given by the Apostle Peter. Because in verse 6, what does Peter say? He says, humble yourself before the Lord God Almighty in his sovereign hand. And then verse 7 he says, casting all your cares upon him. So the command is not cast your cares upon the Lord. The command is actually, in that passage, humble yourself before the Lord. Acknowledge that he's in control. And the way that you do that, verse 7, is by casting your cares upon him. And so how do you cope with your anxieties in this season? You humble yourself before the Lord. You get low, but you don't just get low, you bow down. But you don't just bow down, you literally kneel. You completely humble yourself. Acknowledge that you are in control. God, my health is not good. I feel anxious. But I need to meditate on the fact that you're in control and I'm not. And so I'm going to cast my anxieties to you. God, I'm not sure about my future or my business, and it causes me worry and stress. But I need to meditate and remind myself that you are a great God and that I have zero control, but you have all the control. And so I'm going to humble myself before you and I'm going to give you my anxieties. What's the first objective truth? What's the first motivation that the psalmist wants to give you in order to compel you or motivate you to come and worship? It's this, the truth of God's greatness. But notice the second motivation that he gives you, and it's not just the truth of God's greatness, but it's also the truth of God's nearness. The truth of God's nearness. You see, this psalm doesn't just speak of a God who is big and powerful and sovereign. This psalm speaks about a God who, even though he is big and powerful and sovereign, he's one who draws near to you. He's a God who cares for you. He's a God who longs for intimacy with you, and so he loves you. And so in verse 6, you'll notice the slight change in language where the psalmist doesn't just talk about the Lord and the God of the earth, but he actually starts speaking about our God and our Lord. Do you notice that? Look at verse 6. It says, O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. When you see kings or queens in our world, you're quite often starstruck, I'm sure, but you're also left in no doubt as to their inapproachability. That's why they drive in blacked out cars and live in guarded castles and travel with a bodyguard on each side. You're left in no doubt that that person, that king, that queen is inapproachable. Which is why you see the stark irony when we're introduced and shown the King of Kings, God in heavens. He's the king who rules over every other king, yet he's not inapproachable. Notice the language of verse 7. He's described not only as a king, but as a shepherd. He's the shepherd king. It makes no sense. This goes against every other picture of kingship that we've ever seen or heard. That this king isn't just a king of greatness, he's a king of nearness. That this king isn't just a king who is powerful, but a king who is personal. That this king isn't just one who reigns above us, but one who dwells among us. It's like what the psalmist says in chapter 8. He says, when I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, I think to myself, what is man that you're mindful of him? This is our God. You know, sociologists have defined millennials, who's kind of the generation today in their 20s and early 30s, as people who are, fancy title, moralistic therapeutic deists. Fancy title, which pretty much means when they think about God, they think to themselves, he might exist, and if he does, he's just kind of like an absent father. One who kind of created us and then got up and left, doesn't really care about us, kind of like an absentee landlord. And if he does think about us from time to time, he probably just hopes that we're good people. This psalmist says nothing could be further from the truth. God is powerful, but he's personal. God is filled with greatness, but also nearness. And so this psalmist, particularly in a time like this, in a coronavirus pandemic, this psalm helps us fall into one of two errors when we think about God. The first error is this, thinking that God's not really in control. I mean, he is in control in one sense, but he didn't really see this virus coming, and he cares for you, he loves you, he's going to try and do his best for you, but he's just kind of making the most of a bad situation. And so we kind of view God as being reactive. No doubt he's for you, but he's reactive. This psalmist says, no, nothing could be further from the truth. Do not undermine God's sovereignty. He is 100% on the throne. This whole world, remember, is in his hands. This is all a part of God's strange, divine, peculiar providence. But the second extreme we can go to, and the second error, is to say, well, yes, God is sovereign, God is in control, God knew the virus was coming, he sent it, and well, he doesn't actually care as to how this affects me personally. If he has got to do what he's got to do and that has to trample over my plans and he has to kind of cold-heartedly ruin my life, well then so be it. He's not really bothered. This psalm says, no, that's not true either. Yes, God is 100% sovereign, but he's also 100% loving, and he cares about you and your needs. He mourns with you. He cries with you. Doesn't mean to say that he's going to give you everything you want. But like a parent cares for their child, so God loves you. And so the picture we get of this psalmist, and the two motivations we're given by this psalmist as to why we should be compelled to worship God. Firstly, his greatness. Secondly, his nearness. But as we said at the very beginning, this psalm changes very sharply in its tone in the first half and the second half. And what we see really from the second half of verse 7, really through to the end of the chapter, really briefly, isn't a warm invitation. But notice the change we see in the second half of this psalm, where we see a stern warning. Stern warning. Look with me from the end of verse 7. It says this, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. For 40 years I loathed that generation and said, they are a people who go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. Therefore I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest." I'm sure you can quite clearly see the change in tone between the first half of this psalm and the second half. And what might surprise you even more is that this psalm was actually a really common psalm which was commonly read in Jewish life. In fact, it was said that every Sabbath synagogue service, they opened with this psalmist being read. It's a very strange way to open a service, don't you think? As a call to worship. The first half is a great way. The second half, you kind of think, that's a bit strange. Imagine someone was to stand up on Sunday morning and say, okay, I want to give everyone a call to worship this morning. Let's remind ourselves of God's greatness and God's nearness. And then let's remind ourselves of, God's wrath and the thousands of Israelites God killed back in the wilderness generation. You'd think, oh, hold on a second. You should have stopped a little bit earlier. But that's what happened every Sabbath morning. They read this psalm. Seems strange, but if we're totally honest, perhaps it's a warning that we each need to remind ourselves of. Because we, just like the people of Israel, can all be a part of the same worship community. We can go to church, externally look the same, and receive the same spiritual food, but each respond in our hearts in two very different ways. Some of us respond in faith and obedience, and others harden their hearts and walk away not believing the promises or the words of God. They reject his voice. And this psalmist really is referring back to a specific time in the Israelites' history, a time namely really found in Numbers 13 and 14, which really became the defining moment which really symbolized Israel's rebellion and hard-heartedness. At this point, the people of Israel had seen God move in amazing ways. He had been more than kind to them. He had delivered them from the oppressive hand of Pharaoh. He delivered them from slavery in Egypt. He literally split the Red Sea for them to walk through it as their enemies were hot on their tails. He provided them with manna from heaven, water from a rock. He gave them a pillar of cloud in the morning, a pillar of fire in the evening to symbolize his presence with them. And what did the people of Israel do? They grumbled and complained and turned their back on the Lord. In fact, there was one very specific moment in Exodus chapter 17 where the people of Israel grumbled and complained to Moses so much about their lack of water that Moses actually named the place where they grumbled and complained by two titles, Massah and Meribah. It's the two titles which are given for us in this psalm. And so a time in Israel's history where although they had received much privilege, although they had been given direct revelation from the Lord through Moses their mediator, they turned their backs on the Lord and hardened their hearts. That's why the psalmist says at the end of verse 7, "Today, if you hear his voice," that's God's voice, "do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work." In other words, when you hear God's voice, do not be like the Israelites. They all heard God's voice through their servant Moses, yet they all responded in two different ways. Some of them responded in faith and obedience, but the majority of them hardened their hearts and disobeyed. So the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, speaking about this Israelite wilderness generation, he said they all received the same spiritual food and the same spiritual water, yet with most of them God was not pleased. And the same is true for you. Whenever you come to church, whenever you listen to streams like this, you hear the exact same message that the Israelites did. You hear God's voice. That's what the Bible is. It's us listening to God's voice. And you hear the exact same message that many other people in that room or on that stream are also hearing. But every single one of you respond in one of two ways. Either you respond in faith and obedience, or you harden your heart and disobey. And the warning that the psalmist gives us here is, take the warning of the Israelites. Do not harden your hearts. Because look what happened to them when they hardened their hearts. Verse 10, it says, for 40 years I loathed that generation. This is God speaking. I loathed that generation, and said, they are a people who go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. Therefore I swore in my wrath that they should not enter my rest. This language is tough. It's harsh. It sounds. But God says, because you have hardened your hearts, you will not enter my rest. That's a reference to the promised land. You see, in the Old Testament, God had made a promise to his people that they would inherit this wonderful land called the Promised Land. It was the land of Canaan. And in this wilderness generation, they were just so close to entering this promised land that God had promised years before. They were right on the cusp of it. And so Moses actually sent 12 spies in to scout out the land. And they all came back, and one thing they agreed on was this: the land really is amazing. It really is as good as God said that it was. A land flowing with milk and honey. It really is a land of rest. But while they agreed on that, they disagreed on one thing. They disagreed as to whether or not God could really be faithful to his promise and enable them to invade and conquer that land. 10 out of the 12 spies says, the giants are too big. We could never defeat them. We could never conquer that land. God could never be faithful to that promise. While only Joshua and Caleb said, no, we trust God. God has given us his word. We have heard his voice. And so he will be faithful to his promises. But the negativity of the majority swept across all of Israel. And before we knew it, the entire nation almost did not believe God, disobeyed his word, grumbled and complained, and thus ultimately rebelled and alienated themselves from the God who made them. And that little strip of land in the Middle East, Canaan, in the Bible, that really prefigures God's greater plan for rest for all of humanity. Not Canaan, but the new heavens and the new earth. That's where God's people are all ultimately heading. And God has made this promise that all who trust in him and all who listen to his word and obey his voice will enter that place of ultimate rest. And so as you hear this message, and as you reflect on all the ways in which God has been good and gracious to you in your past, in the same way that he was good to the Israelites in their past, you can respond in one of two ways. You can harden your heart, just like many of those Israelites did. Or you can respond in faith and obedience. You can acknowledge that there's a God in heaven who loves you. He's great, he's sovereign, but he loves you, and he sent his son to die for you. And so he invites you to come back into your relationship with him, to give him your ultimate allegiance. And although it's a difficult promise to cling to sometimes, just like those who trusted in God in Israel, they will find rest. You will find rest. Not just a strip of land in the Middle East, but ultimate rest in the new heavens and the new earth, where all the presence and effects of sin will be banished. And so the passage warns us, do not harden your heart as you hear God's voice. Rather, respond in faith and obedience. It can be very difficult when you read Psalms like this to know how exactly to apply it to our lives today, because this psalm was written under the Old Covenant before Jesus came on earth and died on the cross and rose again. And so sometimes it can be difficult to know how to apply Psalms under the New Covenant. But in this case, it's actually particularly easy, because actually the author of the Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 3 quotes this psalm and applies it to the church to whom he's writing. Isn't it interesting that this psalmist was a message which issued warning here in Psalm 95, and it was also a message which was deemed relevant 1,000 years later by the author of Hebrews. It shows that the message of this psalm is relevant to every generation. And so how does the psalmist, or how does the author of the Hebrews apply this psalm to his hearers? How does he want to encourage them not to harden their hearts? What's the means through which they can avoid hardness of heart? Well, I'll be honest, the answer surprised me. Look with me in Hebrews chapter 3. He quotes the psalm in verse 8 to 11. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you any evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. And so how do you do that? How do you avoid this hardness of heart? Look what he says, verse 13. Exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. What's the means through which you can avoid having your heart hardened and you really can enter into God's invitation to worship him? You remind yourself of his greatness and his nearness. You heed the warning of the Israelites, but you also, according to the author of the Hebrews, exhort one another daily. We need community. We need each other. Christians, you need fellow Christians. And you need to be in, the author of Hebrews says here, daily communication with other Christians. Doesn't mean that the church should meet together physically every single day. Not that we could do that now anyway. But every single day you need to be in contact with another Christian for the purpose of mutual encouragement. Doesn't mean that every conversation needs to have a false piety about it. It can be a short text. It could be a phone call. It could be an email. Hope you're keeping well. I'm praying for you. How can I be praying for you more? Here's a verse that encouraged me. Here's a book that encouraged me. You see, Satan desperately wants to get you and isolate you. He knows if he gets you isolated, he can very quickly harden your heart and make you fall into patterns of unbelief. And so are you going to heed this invitation to come and worship? Remember God's greatness. Remember God's nearness. Heed the warning of the Israelites. And do not neglect your community. It's difficult in times like these, but make the extra effort to exhort one another daily. It's well worth the fight. Amen.